This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, our new segment, Exquisite Corpse, a nonsense relay where Joey, Aaron, and I pass along a conversation one thought at a time. Woo! Hi, this is Jess. And this time there's no one to introduce me because we are trying out something new, something unusual, a segment that may or may not ever come back again. It's called Exquisite Corpse, like those drawings where you fold it over a few times and then one person draws the top of the monster, somebody draws the torso of the monster, somebody draws the bottom of the monster, and then you unfold the whole thing and you see what happens and it looks wild and it was fun. We're kind of going to do that with a show where Joey is going to kick us off. Then he's going to pass it to me and I'm going to listen to that. I'm going to pass what I have to say to Aaron, and he's going to listen to what I said. No other context, and take it from there. We'll loop around, and goodness knows what kind of nonsense monster we'll have created by the end of it. Sound good? Okay. Here we go!
Let the experiment begin. Jess, let's talk. So, particularly on the back of last week's conversation about man friends, what do we want to call that? I'm not sure. And, masculinity and the ability to express emotions, I think I've just been a little bit more tuned in to conversations that men are having with each other. And I was noticing some things. I was listening to a podcast about sports, as I want to do on occasion, more than an occasion. Who am I kidding? And these two people were finishing a segment, and at the end of the segment, the guest said, "You're the man." And I was realizing, knowing that this is like a recurring segment that they do, that these two people have really great rapport, it's a regular weekly guest. Like, these two people have love for each other, potentially. Maybe it's not an intense, deep infatuation, but they're texting with each other all the time. They speak every week. They get along great. They have this great rapport. And I realized that this was an instance where this person is trying to say, "I love you," or, that broadly, that sentiment anyways, and is doing it by saying, "You're the man." And I realized, he says this every week. This is like a generally affectionate person. You get that vibe from hearing him speak. And so I was thinking about that idea of like, maybe men are trying to do these things, but doing it in different ways that are not making them feel vulnerable. And so I had this sitting in the back of my head, and, as has been the case in recent months and sort of the confused economic state that the world is in right now, sort of not traditional recession, but recession maybe, and some numbers are up and some numbers down. We've been watching a lot of tech companies do layoffs. And this week there have been a bunch of big announcements. Microsoft laid off, I believe it was 12,000 people, or Google just laid off a large number of people. Maybe it was Google that laid off 12,000 and Microsoft was more, but I think it was 12,000 at Microsoft. Anyways, when you look at the conversations, they say, the companies are saying things like, it's a tough economic situation and we're in a different time and we're needing to respond to market trends. But when you dig a little bit under and you see some of the commentary coming from analysts who have spent more time looking at books, and, in the case of Microsoft, they had $72 billion in profit last year. It was the most profitable year that they've ever faced. Potentially they're making, big announcements with OpenAI and all these other things. And what seems to be the case, as soon as you dig right below the surface is they're just, clear. Maybe there are a few instances where it was no longer economically made sense to have certain teams or whatever, but largely the consensus seems to be that they're just clearing out people within the companies that they felt aren't performing at the level that they should be, or, had to make, in quotes, hard decisions about things like that. But it brought me to this idea of euphemisms and the fact that, in the instance where it's men talking to each other about maybe straight men stuck in, at least an American concept of masculinity, are unable to talk about love. And so they turn to euphemisms of you're the best, or you're the man, or whatever it is. And in these instances of employment, they're saying things like, we had to let people go, or we're downsizing, or if someone quits a job, they say they left the company. And, I think there are a lot of instances where euphemism is deployed with, let's say, care or comfort, right? We use a lot of euphemisms around death because it can be a really taboo subject, and there are dramatic cultural distinctions around how people interact and speak about death. But, by saying, instead of saying I'm sorry your husband died, or I'm sorry your father or mother died, or your child died, people will say they passed away, or I know they're looking down on you, or these other things that sort of don't have the same emotional amplitude, but can at least convey care and acknowledge this current circumstance that someone's in, right? And so that's one instance where we're deploying euphemism for the benefit of the other, and maybe other things fit in this conversation too, right? The idea of, we often use euphemism around our bodies, both our own bodies and other people's bodies, right? There are literally books written talking about how everyone poops. Granted, children's books, fair enough, accepted. But at the same time, we know everyone poops. We know everyone pees. But when we talk about those things, we say, people will say something like, I have to tinkle, or I have to run to the men's room or the ladies' room, or I have to go number one, or I have to go number two. And in all of those instances, you're just saying, I have to pee. Everyone knows you have to pee, but let's, as best we can, pretend that we're not actually thinking about the thing that's happening. And again, that feels like for the benefit of other people. For some reason, that is a taboo, and maybe is evolutionary, right? Animals tend to try to do those things in private to reduce exposure and physical vulnerability. But when you start to get into these instances where we're deploying euphemism as a mechanism to control perception, either of ourselves or of a company or an entity, or to sort of deploy narrative control through obfuscation, it puts us in this interesting position, right? You're trying to protect your company, your livelihood. You don't want someone to perceive you in a way that they may feel is negative and that may long-term negatively impact you. But the result is also that we sort of we put ourselves in a conceptual cocoon that feels maybe more comfortable or easy to navigate, or allows us to sort of maintain living in this sort of limbo state. I bringing it back, right there, I don't know that this still gets brought up, but I remember, when I was younger, seeing things on TV or hearing people say things that are just like absolutely ridiculous, like, women don't poop, like someone makes some sort of reference and they're like, women don't poop, that doesn't happen, like that there is sort of a desire to avoid reality with these sort of cocoons. And I think, if you accept that it's okay in some instances to deploy these euphemisms to sort of soften language, to care for someone, or to lessen the blow or ease the blow of providing someone support in difficult times. Like, that seems fair and makes sense. But at the same time, there's this potential for that communication style, I guess, to run rampant and to become pervasive in a way where we are sort of avoiding reality in increased ways, right? That orientation towards politeness and care, while useful in certain instances, becomes something that we're good at and that we have to get good at in order to build sort of personal relationships with other people. But then once you're good at it, you start using it in many places. In these instances where something bad happens, you try to avoid it. And then all of a sudden, you start using it in places like, building emotional, healthy, thriving friendships or romantic relationships, because you continue to deploy this method of using euphemisms to insulate or protect yourself or protect other people. And you get stuck in this space where you wind up not saying anything. And well, it feels disingenuous to say that those things are a lie, right? If you say a company is downsizing, everyone knows that you mean layoffs and that people were fired, right? What they're trying not to say is that we fired people today, because that feels harsh or it carries additional connotation. And at the same time, what do we lose by not having these direct conversations, by using euphemisms to obscure conversations about truth and reality? Like in this instance, is Microsoft just making the decision to let people go because they weren't doing a good job? They don't want to harm other people. And at the same time, like, does it give them permission to hide behind these euphemisms and not have the hard conversations because they never said the hard thing? And so I guess if I were to wrap this in a question as I pass it to you, even though we're in a different format, I'm curious what you think is the right places or the right ways to deploy euphemism, or should we abandon it altogether, or is that simply too harsh and hard and inhuman a way to interact with the world? I'm not sure. I guess, is there a right way and a wrong way, or a good way and a bad way, or a better way and a worse way to use euphemisms?
Aaron, I think my take is that euphemisms can only help, with like a little asterisk at the top with a footnote, when intended to be used well. The way that Joey lays it out, there's definitely the bad use of euphemism where you're just trying to avoid saying something you don't want to say. So you use a euphemism because you feel guilty and you'd rather not say the hard thing directly. That's not really so much the thing. I think I'm wondering about this situation of when you're trying to communicate something to someone and you're trying to use euphemism to mediate that. And I think there's sort of a baseline assumption that euphemism is less risky, sort of like, why not go with a euphemism? It can't hurt because best case, it actually aids in communication. It helps someone hear something that, they might not otherwise be able to hear. And I don't know, I want to unpack that a little bit because I think that, when Joey brought up this topic, he talked a little bit about this idea of, the dark side of where euphemism can go wrong. And I don't know, I'm trying to figure out if I really think that the cons outweigh the pros. So maybe I can talk a little bit about some of these thoughts. First of all, euphemism is inherently a mediator, right? Like if you didn't use it, you would be just saying the most direct version of the thing. And we know and have talked about on this show before, direct communication styles are not inherently better. In some cultures, you almost, certainly might even prefer more indirect communication styles. And I would describe euphemism as a type of indirect communication. And at the end of the day, what is communication but a message transmitted, delivered, and received? Did they get it? Because then who cares if they said it their way, if they said it the softer way or a roundabout way? Maybe in fact, the best case scenario is that euphemism is the only way to successfully communicate a point so that then someone hears it properly, like I was saying. And the downsides to me feel like, I guess sort of the more minor worst case is just that they don't get it. So like the euphemism just obscured what you were trying to say. And a more dramatic risk of like, if whatever you were trying to say was important, I guess that would be an issue. But if the other option is to not use euphemism and to speak in more direct terms, the downside of that is they mistook what you said and they are not happy about it, right? Like that they interpreted what you said the wrong way, or maybe in a meaner or, some kind of darker way than you ever intended if you had maybe softened it up a little bit with euphemism. And I think this opens up another point that I think is key to this question that I have around, is euphemism a safer bet? Because it also just opens up this thought about, what people like to use versus what they like to receive. And, again, this is something we've talked about on the show before about how many different studies and explorations there are comparing and contrasting different communication styles. But I was starting to think about, what about specifically euphemism as just like a very a more specific and narrow version of this. So I was thinking about a little matrix, like imagine a quadrant where it's like on the rows, you've got euphemisms versus saying the thing directly and outright. And then in the columns, you've got what you prefer to use versus what you prefer to receive. So then you sort of have a little, combination set of, what you, like when you prefer to use euphemisms, when you prefer to say something directly, when you prefer to receive euphemisms, and when you prefer to receive something directly. And when I started thinking about it, I was like, oh, for myself, well, I almost never prefer to use euphemisms, except for like a couple of things that make me uncomfortable to talk about, or cursing, which is like a very specific use case for me, just because in my personal belief system, it just makes cursing more potent if you save it for very special times. But anyway, that's like besides the point. It just ultimately, like, I realize I almost never prefer to use euphemism, and almost all the time prefer to just say things unfiltered. especially when it is a thought that I have, or even if it's a criticism of something, because it's so hard for me to weave in the, to weave in the softness. And I can imagine other people might feel this way, but I can also imagine people find euphemism sort of a safety net where you don't have to say those things. But for me personally, I think it's easier to just not have to filter. Whereas when it comes to how I prefer to receive, I think I prefer to receive euphemisms almost all of the time, because if someone's trying to, tell me some bad news or give me, negative feedback or critique or something, pretty much anything that I might be sensitive about, euphemism probably will only help me. Whereas, in receipt, hearing those things directly definitely are more likely to, make me mistake someone's intentions or make me get defensive or something like that. And maybe this is where it takes me to this last point, because I can't tell if it's my own bias of what I prefer receiving or not, but it got me thinking about, like, what is, if the common wisdom, and maybe you disagree, I my kind of underlying assumption is that the common wisdom suggests euphemism is generally a safer bet. And I guess when you think about it, though, like, if you're trying to tell somebody something bad, which is largely the use case, and somebody doesn't really want to hear that news because it's negative, then, there's not much that you can really do about that. If someone doesn't want to hear what you have to say, can't euphemism only help? And I at the same time, I was looking into an example to try to pressure test this, and came across something that I had learned about in college, which was sort of like the organizational case example of the Shuttle Challenger and the engineering consultants who basically the group that were responsible for making a recommendation of whether the rocket was safe enough to launch. And the engineers all made a very formal, potentially you could say, like, it's a little bit indirect, but you could potentially call it a euphemism, sort of shrouded in the formality of this recommendation. But they very clearly made their recommendation: no, this is a very dangerous idea. There is a problem with this part called the O-ring, and something will go terribly wrong, almost certainly. And it was really interesting because that was an example of maybe, a little bit of that indirect euphemistic, but still, trying to communicate a point, and no one paid any never mind. And then there was, the official sign-off director, named Alan McDonald, who was very forceful in objecting, and it got him demoted. And they still went ahead with this decision to launch the rocket, and the horrible, fateful, turnout of that was that it clearly was the wrong decision. But kind of either way, whether it was the two different styles of the engineers objecting ultimately didn't even matter, because the recipient didn't want to receive the news that they had to share, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, a euphemism can only do so much when the message that you're transmitting is not something somebody wants to receive. And at best, maybe is a way to give you a little bit of a leg up. And, maybe I'm focusing too much on these negative examples because I think that is maybe the strongest use case for euphemism versus what Joey had talked about where euphemism starts to get, overused. But I'm really interested in understanding, how harmful is it really to use euphemism more often than not? Why not err on the side of euphemism just in case? Because maybe they're not even going to want to hear it anyway.
Well, well, well. Joey, 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 you have set us up for a very, very interesting loop-a-doop here. And, um, I feel very attacked by this topic, which should not be very surprising. I'm a reformed Midwesterner, 12-year Catholic school veteran. And I think when it comes to euphemism in general, it is so natural, if not a necessary linguistic style, if you grow up in a guest culture. And I think, some folks might remember we did an episode a while ago about ask cultures versus guest cultures. And in ask cultures, communication that is direct and clear and blunt is prioritized, whereas in guest culture, you are always not giving the full story. And it's not that one is better than the other. It's that they're very, very common for a few different reasons. And I think some of these get into where euphemism is a really helpful tool in getting someone to say or in getting someone to hear something that maybe they don't want to hear. And I think there's sort of three ways that I see euphemisms most often used. And yes, it's because I use them this way. How quiet you. I think the first and most charitable is that euphemisms are a really, really powerful way or a powerful tool to disarm uneasy listeners. Sometimes anything that's communicated in too direct a way, of course, is going to throw up defense mechanisms right and left. And you really have to presume that the listener comes from a background either in which directness is rewarded and expected, or at the very least feels psychologically safe. And that's never something that universally we can know. And it's one thing in a work environment, it's another thing in a road rage environment, right? Where somebody cuts you off and you're like, I don't like the way your car moved in my lane. But I think that disarming those uneasy listeners is where it's used colloquially. I think the other way that it's used most is to navigate really threatening ambiguity. So it's not so much about disarming a listener, it's when you don't know what that listener's reaction could be or what the implications of what you're saying could be beyond what that listener has received and who they'll tell to other people. And this is another thing that goes back to this notion of guest culture. You never really know who or how you're going to offend. It's very common in like small towns because you know that word is going to travel and you don't know how that's going to mess up your next grocery store trip or the next time that you run into someone at the store. And so when you don't know what the outcomes are going to be, it feels safer to use a euphemism because it softens the blow and it actually opens up for misinterpretation, which I understand is a fundamental issue of them. But I think a very important thing that euphemism can do is that it can dismantle very distracting framing. So like there's some pretty basic euphemisms like used car versus certified pre-owned. And like, yes, that is very cringe. It's very marketing speak, but both of them are just choices for how to characterize the relationship between that car and its previous owner. And there's no question that all of the associations that are loaded into the phrase used are going to distract from perhaps all the work that goes into making sure that a used car is safe, is clean and usable, has been through countless inspections. It also, when you call it certified pre-owned, it at least opens up a little bit more of like, okay, so it was owned before. Maybe that means that it was owned last year versus 5 years ago. All these things I think cue up just a little bit more openness, and they dismantle a frame that might obscure useful information and useful perspective depending on what your goal is. Now, with all three of those things, and I think a lot of the conversation that Jess brought up is thinking about euphemism as a tool. It is a thing that is used for a specific discrete purpose, and therefore it can be successful or unsuccessful. And I think that there's a fourth use that is the way that I absolutely love euphemism, which is that it's just an everyday game. Language is play. Language is fun. And communicating the thing without communicating the thing and seeing how far you can go and how lateral you can go and how distant you can go while still landing the point is a never-ending joy. I think it's ascribed to Winston Churchill, but he's describing at some point a lie, but he's saying, "Oh no, it's not a lie. It's a terminological inexactitude," and I'm like, first of all, it's Winston Churchill. He's got some really good linguistic play in general. But more specifically, like, I love the idea of like, no, let's add more syllables. Let's just make it more complicated. And let's see like who picks it up, who thinks what about it. Now, whether or not it was actually used to fundamentally obscure the meaning of lie and to add flourish, I mean, who knows? The jury's going to be out on that one forever. But I do think at the end of the day, euphemism is fun. Euphemism reminds ourselves that the thing that we traffic in every moment of every day, which is verbal language, written and spoken, doesn't just have to be for the work of communication. It in and of itself can be purposeless play and fun and joy. I also think that when we get to, I've got one other, I'm sorry, I'm distracted by one other euphemism that I love that I can't let go of, which is our dear friend Justin Timberlake at the Super Bowl. I'm not going to name the other artist who you all know, but when she went through her wardrobe malfunction, like, wow, that was a choice. And admittedly, it sort of goes directly not against, but it's the flip side of the point I was just making, where we kind of know, especially in a PR environment that we live in now, that like the language being used is intended to obscure. It's intended to make people work just a little bit harder to pick up on what is going on. And I think linguistic obfuscation, we should talk about it. Like, it's not just in euphemism in the context of providing feedback or in trying to describe something in a fanciful way. Like, this is legal writing. This is, I love all my legal listeners out there, and I shout out to you. Understanding all the ways to say something without saying something in a highly litigious culture is necessary. There are times when, and we see this all the time in both PR and legal briefs and contracts, where it is said perhaps in a remarkably detailed fashion and is arguably very direct, but it's so detailed that the average person can't understand it or would need much more time to digest it than they have when they're getting pressured to sign something. And additionally, there are sometimes ways to frame things within their greater context that are explicitly meant to obscure terms or conditions that may not be very palatable and may not be in someone's best interest, but it is truthful the way that it's written. And I think that those are also euphemisms. So, I clearly am a little bit torn about this. I think that euphemisms in and of themselves are a useful and worthwhile tool. I don't think that they're fundamentally negative, but I do wonder if we took all of the euphemisms off the table, what do we do with language next?
As always, Aaron, taking the thoughtful, circumspect approach to my absolutist take. Maybe I wasn't being absolutist, but, I think one of the big points that you brought up that is interesting, and certainly I don't think I was considering in the moment when I initially raised this question, is the idea of sort of the litigiousness of American culture, anyways, at the very least, where we're all hailing from, and the need to be protective in speech and deploying euphemisms as a result, as a means to protect yourself from saying something that could come back to harm or threaten you. And it's also interesting thinking about what does a culture value, right? The sort of guessing culture dynamic that you brought up of the Midwest, and this idea of, do you value comfort or the comfort of others even more than the truth, and vice versa? Certainly, we hear about things within other cultures that maybe have a more direct and honest, whether or not in everyday life, certainly at least get cast culturally, rightly or wrongly, as being more honest or direct. I'm thinking about, German culture or Dutch culture or Israeli culture, maybe, where you say the thing. Why would I hide the thing? This is the truth. This is the facts. There's no reason to hide from the facts. Your comfort is not more important than the truth type of ideas. And again, I'm not an expert on any of those cultures, but those sort of mimetic ideas about those cultures exist, probably based on some kernel of truth. And in all of those cases, I've experienced a little bit of that, maybe more anecdotally myself. But that idea of, are you trying to, one, protect yourself, like you said, in the litigious nature of things, not trying not to say the truth if you're worried about things like deploying, instead of saying like, we fired a bunch of people because our company was performing poorly, right, which can come back to bite you. You say, we were downsizing as a means to become more efficient and increase shareholder value, right? Like Wall Street is going to respond to those two things very differently, and the full truth, will create reactions out in the world that are then outside of your control. Like, I get it. It is just sort of this interesting thing of, whether for fear or protection or for another person's comfort, is there a sacrifice that you make as, sacrificing current discomfort for future success, whether as a company talking about their own performance, right? That's the thing, is like euphemism is powerful, right? Language is powerful, like you suggested, and by deploying a euphemism, it can make you feel comfortable and maybe even give you the ability to hide from the reality of a situation, of not contending with the true conditions which are arising that might impede future performance, or allow someone to grow in a way that allows them to get better at whatever it is they're doing. I'm thinking in that case about conversations about personal performance feedback that might happen at work or in a relationship, right? Where you don't say the full truth of something as means to not hurt someone's feelings, but then ultimately that person, you're not getting the interaction that you're hoping to get, and that person isn't necessarily getting the opportunity to grow because they don't fully understand the ways in which the things they're doing are impacting other people. It is a bit of an idealistic conversation, obviously, right? Like, there is no such thing as absolute truth in the ways in which we communicate. We don't communicate in pure data. We don't communicate in numbers. We communicate in our subjective understanding of concepts that still requires interpretation on either side of that conversation. And so even saying, like, we're talking about degrees here of how honest we are and how much euphemism can inhibit having an honest conversation or the ability to see the capital T truth in the world. But there is no such thing as sort of pure, like, true, right, honest, accurate conversation, because you're still needing to understand things through your own subjective lens, communicate them back out into the world that someone else then interprets based on their subjective lens and understanding what you're saying, right? So there's no like absolute outcome, even if maybe we do rely maybe more heavily than we should on euphemisms, or some people or cultures rely on it more than they should. There's no like 1 or 0, black or white sort of outcome on these things. The last thing I would say that I thought was really interesting that you brought up was around this idea of play within language and the ways in which euphemisms might fall into that. And I always think about, the difference here maybe being the difference between a euphemism and an idiom, and maybe a euphemism can be an idiom, but an idiom isn't necessarily a euphemism, right? Like that sort of visceral reaction that you can create with an idiom, and we've spoken about this before, is always potent. But in some ways, the idioms are attempting to get at a deeper truth that maybe direct, plain language can't sort of achieve the emotionality of something. And in some ways, right, you can deploy metaphor and language as a way to both hide from the truth or attempt to get more deeply emotionally conveying more meaning, right? I always laugh at a phrase that my mom or my parents say, and we may have spoken about this before on the show, but the phrase that someone looks shit at and hit, right? The idea that somehow by saying that someone looks shit at and hit, it sounds much more potent than saying they didn't look very good and they look tired and maybe they're not doing well or life has been hard on them or whatever. Like, it says so many of those things all wrapped up and has this like emotional, visceral dynamic embedded in it that it's actually carrying more truth in the way that, saying I'm running to the blue room, or I need to go powder my nose, or whatever things people say about the bathroom is sort of the opposite of that. It's deploying metaphor or some sort of shared understanding to reduce the capacity for truth, but that both can actually be playful in some way, but that idioms feel more playful because it's about like fun and trying to capture more, while euphemism is about trying to like hide from something that is either taboo or uncomfortable. And so, right, it sort of inherently feels like you can't play, right, if you're deploying a euphemism because you don't feel safe, as you spoke about, or we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. You're starting from like a fear place, which is kind of antithetical to play. But I mean, ultimately, there's no resolution to this type of conversation, but it is an opportunity to sort of look at our own language that we deploy in uncomfortable situations and begin to evaluate whether it's serving us. I can't say, I've never been in this situation where I've needed to make a public statement because I am somehow either responsible for communicating to the world that my company laid off 12,000 people or 18,000 people. That is just a extremely difficult and challenging situation to be in. And I want to admit that I have no context. I haven't ever had to do that. And I feel for anyone who has to sort of present that information to the world and to their company and their coworkers and any of that. But that said, if we bring it back down to our own lives and we think about the places where we feel uncomfortable ourselves and maybe more likely to deploy euphemistic speech, is it serving us? Is it helping us? Is it helping the people that we're speaking to? And if it's not, maybe finding an opportunity to be a little bit more choiceful and intentional about what we're saying and why, to accomplish better outcomes for ourselves and for the people that we are in relationships with and whatever. But again, we can't let idealism or absolutism get in the way here. There's always going to be taboo conversations and uncomfortable things that we sort of shy away from or maybe are in some way allergic to, and obviously that's okay. But euphemisms, I will say, instead of saying all of you are great, you're the best, you're wonderful, I will say, I love you both. I love this weird experiment, independent of what this will sound like at the end. And I will continue pursuing truth in whatever capacity that may come in.
Critical Nonsense is a Seal Vein production. Brought to you by Corpses to Go, a Cold Cat's Bistro. We would like to thank executive producer and expert non-swearer, Jess Vander. We would also like to thank our executive thinkers and Exquisite Corpse delivery men, Joey K. Meyer and Aaron Powers. This show could not be possible without the help of programming coordinator and euphemism spinner, Les Jacobs. I barely was able to pronounce that. We could not forget to mention our production crew of Cutie Corpses, Sarah Gilbert and Nora Mestrich. And obviously, ex-Cannibal Corpse listener and sound engineer Alex Conte, aka me. As always, thank you, Sorrieland. Special thanks to The Last of Us. I know I'm late to the game, but speaking of corpses, I had to mention that I just joined the show and I'm really liking it. And that's it for this week's experiment. We love you. See you all next week.